The question burned in her mind, circling endlessly. Where did it come from, really? Was it her training that had shaped these questions? Subtle messages had been picked up over the years, and now they were an inseparable part of her. She had thought that some people, in some places, didn't belong. But had those thoughts been forming for so long without her even realizing it? Linda had spent her entire career convincing herself that she was impartial. She had always treated everyone the same, without distinction. But that night, with Grant, all that had changed. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth was, she couldn't keep that thought in mind. There was no clear answer. Not yet, but for the first time, she couldn't take her eyes off the question. Joanna looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, good. Linda sighed, because she didn't realize what she had been holding back. And then, for the first time since that night, she faced the truth without fighting it. She accepted it. 2 months later, Linda returned to the police station. Everything seemed the same, but something was different. The station was still noisy with the familiar noise. Phones rang, boots clicked loudly on the tile floor, the whispers of officers exchanging reports. But something in the air had changed. People looked at her without judgment, without pity, just silently observing. Linda no longer blamed them. She walked to her desk, put her things down, but just as she was about to sit down, a figure passed by. Nathaniel Grant. He didn't stop, didn't say a word, just continued walking toward his office. But when he reached the door, he stopped, turned back for a moment. Carson, he called. Linda paused. Sir. There was a pause. Then he said, welcome back. Linda swallowed, and said softly, thank you. Grant nodded, walked into the office, and closed the door behind him. For the first time in weeks, Linda breathed a sigh of relief. She had been given a second chance. And now, what she did with it was entirely up to her. Prejudice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with open vilification or hatred. Sometimes it lurks in silence, in invisible assumptions, in hasty decisions based on fear and conditioning. The question isn't whether it exists, but whether you're willing to face it. And if you are, what will you do about it? If this story makes you think, share it. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her palms cold. After 50 days without pay, she thought everything would collapse. The unfair training had left her exhausted, almost exhausted. She thought disappointment would be the worst, that anger, dissatisfaction would rise. But instead, she felt only emptiness, a strange, heavy feeling. None of those emotions came. Instead, there was something else. A strange feeling she had never recognized, a feeling of oppression that had crept into her heart since the tense encounter with Grant. A feeling of shame. She felt like she had overreacted, had abused her power and could not go back. In the end, she only received a cold, wordless look. Grant was right. That day, things were not over yet. On the first day of her new training, she felt ashamed. The room was small, with a few officers, some new, some seasoned. They didn't talk much, no one wanted to be there. The instructor was a retired detective, an older, silver-haired woman named Joanna Pierce. Her eyes were cold, unreadable, as if she could see through everything. She pressed a button, and the video started. A video of a police stop played. The man in the video, a black man, was stopped for a traffic violation. The officer, who was white, like her, escalated things. His tone was stern and threatening, while the man just wanted to keep his distance. The officer's tone was calm, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Eventually, the officer arrested the man. The room fell silent as the video ended. Joanna folded her arms, her eyes moving from person to person, finally settling on Linda. Let's talk about assumptions, she said. A silence fell. Everyone was silent. Then Joanna turned to Linda, asking softly, what did the officer see when he stopped that man? Linda felt her throat tighten, she knew the answer. He saw a threat, she replied, her voice trailing off. Joanna nodded, her eyes still locked on her. So, when you stopped Sheriff Grant, what did you see? Linda felt a wave of tension rise in her, and she swallowed, feeling a weight on her chest. A threat. Joanna tilted her head, continuing to stare at her, not saying a word. Linda couldn't take her eyes off her, feeling like the whole room was watching her. The last question was like a strong kick to her mind. Harris's eyebrows rose slightly, his eyes never leaving the screen, as if he couldn't believe she was being so blunt. He flipped to another page in the file. You noted here that the driver was uncooperative, he said, his voice even but strained. Linda clenched her hands under the table, feeling her fingers curl into fists. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. I think he was resisting, because he wasn't following orders, she said, her voice steady but still a little tense. For the first time, Harris looked up from the file, their eyes meeting. She could feel the silence in the air, so heavy that every word they spoke was waiting for agreement. After a long pause, Harris cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Chief Grant, do you have anything to add? He asked, his eyes never leaving the file. Grant leaned back in his chair, his eyes still trying to read her for a long moment. He let out a soft breath and shook his head. Nothing. Harris closed the file decisively, the dry sound echoing in the quiet room. Here's the situation we're in, he continued. You've been on the force for 15 years without any prior discipline, which is a plus. However, the use of force without reasonable cause is a serious matter. This is not something that can be ignored. Linda felt her heart beat faster. She knew things were getting closer to the end. Harris didn't stop. The minimum suspension is 60 days, without pay. You will also be required to attend escalation and bias training. Any further misconduct, especially of this kind, will end your employment. Linda sighed. Although this was not the outcome she had hoped for, at least she had a chance to make things right. She nodded, aware of the future that awaited her. Harris stood up, gathering his papers. We'll finish the paperwork, he said, turning to look at Grant. Thank you. Linda stood up, walking toward the door, but as she neared it, Grant still hadn't moved. His eyes didn't leave hers, his face unreadable. When she touched the doorknob, he spoke, his voice quiet but commanding. If this isn't over, you're not coming back, Linda. She paused, her hand tightening on the doorknob. She exhaled, forcing herself to calm down, knowing he was right. Her work was really just beginning. Linda sat in the car, alone, looking out at the parking lot. Her eyes were on the station, unsure of what the future held, but feeling the change was near. She sat there, feeling the silence around her squeeze everything. Wondering if she did the right thing, if it was all a mistake. His words still echoed in her head. You can convince yourself that it was just an accident, but you can sit down and face it. She had told herself many times that she would never let emotions rule her, that she was always the one who drifted, always kept herself in control. But that night, everything changed. The feeling rose up inside her, unable to be pushed back. And now, it had become a heavy mass that could not be let go. On the 5th day, the call came. She didn't know if she could face it anymore. She clenched her hands on the steering wheel, sweating, feeling like she was sinking. When the car stopped, the doors of the station opened. The sky was bright but it did not do wrong. As she entered the gallery, she felt all eyes on her. Quietly, she walked quickly to where 3 people were waiting. Captain Jenkins and 2 others, an investigator and, him. She did not look back at him, knowing that he did not look at her either. Let's begin, the investigator, Mitchell, spoke, his eyes lightly scanning the file. At the stop, Ko was alone again, but she could only say one sentence. You stopped the car because the driver did not signal. That's right. She nodded slightly. Mitchell continued, the paper girls in the file. And then, you proceeded to use force, right? Everything around her was lonely like pieces of scrap. She could feel his presence, his every word like cotton hitting her heart, cold and cruel. She was silent for a moment, then bit her lips, saying, I. Grant leaned back on the couch, looking straight at Linda, his eyes never leaving her. You hit me because you disappointed me, he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. But have you ever wondered why I disappointed you? She looked down, not answering, but in her eyes, a clear answer as if wanting to say it but not far away. She shouldn't be allowed to hide. She knew this, and I knew she knew. Her chest tightened, as if trying to hold back. Grant didn't ease the fear. You think I'll be nervous, right? Think I'll fight for my wallet, treat it like I've committed a crime. But no, he remained calm, unchanged. And it was that calmness that made her even more confused, like a needle piercing the armor in her heart. Don't you see it? Grant moved his head, his eyes searching Linda's, as if he wanted her to realize something she still didn't understand. It wasn't all about race. She might not have found it, but, how did she feel when someone was considered a threat just because they existed? His words made her sweet. The words rang out, echoing in her mind, like an echo of an endless river. She didn't know what to say. And that night, the city beyond would grow quieter. None of us asked you to be here to tear someone apart, Grant continued, his voice soft, but like a knife. I ask you, because you need to make a choice. Linda frowned. Choose what? Grant turned, his eyes calm. You can ignore it all, tell yourself it was just a mistake. A mistake that had something to worry about. He paused, each word falling softly, heavy. Or you can sit back, face it, and really wonder why all of this happened. Linda was silent, not answering. She looked out the window, the city lights shimmering on the water. Grant got up and walked away, without a final word. When the police call you back, he said, his voice ringing out one last time, they will ask you what you learned from all this. Prepare your answer. And then he stepped back, leaving her alone in the dark. Linda sat there, her watery eyes following the darkness. For the first time, she felt the heaviness in her heart, in what she had done. But that silence was not the end. For the next 3 days, Linda fell silent. No phone calls, no calls from the police, no messages from her usual work friends. Nothing. Everything seemed erased, without a trace, as if she had been forgotten, melted into the invisibility of the long night. She quietly put down the phone, feeling a tightness in her chest, as if there was a pause in the air. After the long call, before she could say a word, Linda knew she couldn't hesitate any longer. She pulled on her coat and walked quickly out the door, her heart filled with anxiety. When she reached Riverside Park, the air was cool, the streetlights flickering weakly on the sidewalk. The park was almost deserted, save for a few joggers, a couple sitting on a bench, and a man walking his dog. A second later, Linda found herself standing across from him. Nathaniel Grant stood not far away, one hand in his pocket, looking at the river flowing under the bridge without turning around. She thought about leaving, but there was something about him, the way he stood there, that seemed unworried and strangely calm. Her feet kept moving toward him, unable to stop. When she was only a few feet away, she said, "You called me." Grant nodded, still not looking at her. "Do you know why I didn't report you?" Linda asked, her voice low. Grant turned slowly, facing her, and answered, "Because I wanted you to sit with it first." The tension in her jaw was even more pronounced, but she said nothing. There was only silence for a moment. You don't hear his calm voice, Linda told herself, but there was something heavy and scary behind his words. Linda looked around, not knowing how to respond. Finally, he nodded toward the bench. She hesitated, but there was no way to ignore the firmness of his voice. This wasn't a request, he said, which she couldn't refuse. She sat down. Grant followed, resting his elbows on his knees, staring out at the water, and began to speak. Have you ever been pulled back by Carson? Linda was startled, and paused. She didn't quite understand the question, but she felt more nervous than ever. Have you ever been stopped by the police? He asked, his voice calm. They asked for your license, where you were going. She shook her head. Maybe, once or twice. But nothing major. He took a deep breath. I've been stopped in every city I've lived in. Linda felt her stomach tighten, her heart pounding. He wasn't just talking about the usual police stop. He was telling her a longer story, one that Linda didn't know, but that would surely affect her. Linda was silent, not knowing what to say. Linda didn't answer Grant, she just sat there, her eyes blank as she tried to process what had just happened. She lowered her head, her elbows lightly touching the desk, the cold feeling from the desk passed through her body, but still couldn't ease the pain in her heart. Why did you hit me? Her question fell out like a sigh, but it stabbed into the air like a cold knife. She didn't expect a real answer from Grant. She knew that she couldn't change anything, and it was all just a power play, a performance, nothing more. Grant sat opposite, his eyes silent but heavy. His answer remained unchanged. Did he feel threatened? His voice was like a cold wind, without any emotion, just a lifeless question that needed no explanation. Did I offend you? Linda felt her throat tighten. She tried to answer, but every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck in her chest. She looked into Grant's eyes, finding no sympathy or truth in them. He just continued to sit there, his gaze unmoving. So what exactly impressed you? His question was like a blow to her heart. She felt like she was being sucked into this room, the walls closing in around her, making it hard to breathe. Grant remained silent. There was no anger, no demeaning words, just a lingering silence. Linda felt tired, as if the whole space had stopped. When Grant stood up and took a breath, she was not prepared for what came next. He placed a single piece of paper on the table. Notice of suspension, he said, his voice calm, as if it were an everyday occurrence. Linda felt her hands tremble as she touched the paper. Chief Grant. She tried to call him, but couldn't continue. Grant turned and left, leaving her in a heavy silence. She stood there, feeling like she was sinking into a bottomless abyss. Her legs were no longer steady, and her steps felt like someone was pulling her back. When the door opened, Howard was standing outside, but she couldn't see him, only feeling like the space was crumbling. As she stepped outside, Grant's last words still echoed in her head, "We're not done yet." Linda sat down on the couch, still holding the suspension notice. She read it over, word for word, as if hoping to find something that would change. But no, nothing had changed. She never thought she would be in this situation, never thought that after 15 years of being a police officer, she could be suspended. And now, all she could do was wait. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen, saw the name Nathaniel Grant appear. Although she hesitated, her fingers still slid across the screen. Anxiety crossed her stomach. What would come next? Grant's lips pursed slightly, as if he were measuring her every word, every move. He wasn't in a hurry, he wasn't pressing, but the longer the silence dragged on, the more Linda felt as if time was slowing down. It felt like every second, every minute was a test, forcing her to face the truth she knew, but didn't dare admit. Hit the suspect. Grant's voice was soft, but there was no hiding the sharpness in it. Linda took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Her hands clenched under the table, her mind racing with hundreds of questions. What did she do wrong? Why did she have to explain this in front of him, in front of Captain Howard, in front of people who had a different view of her? Yes, I hit the suspect, Linda said, her voice no longer as sure as before, but there was nothing else to do but admit it. But that was when he wouldn't cooperate. He wouldn't follow orders. Oh, really? Grant raised an eyebrow, not surprised. "So, do you think your actions could be misunderstood?" Linda looked straight into his eyes, trying to find some sympathy, but those cold eyes did not easily forgive her. "I only did what I thought was necessary." The tension in the air seemed to rise. Captain Howard had no expression on his face, just stood there, his eyes still fixed on them. It felt like everything was under control, but in reality, only Grant knew what would happen next. "Linda," Grant finally spoke, his voice a little softer, but still full of authority. "We will have to review everything. And I want you to understand that these decisions can affect your career." Linda felt her body tighten, but she tried not to show her emotions. She knew that this was the most important moment of her life. One wrong decision could change everything. She said nothing, Grant had said nothing. No threats, no warnings. Just a long, cold silence that suffocated her. It was more painful than any scream. She shook her head, a single word, nothing. "Forget it, Reynolds," she told herself, but his eyes followed her for a moment, longer than she thought possible. "I'll stop now," he breathed. "Good friend, Linda," he said, as if he wanted to say something, but then he didn't. She stood there, feeling the seconds pass in silence, heavy and dark. Linda turned, trying to regain her composure, but as her hand touched the doorknob, a strange feeling rose within her. Nathaniel Grant had let her go, without immediate consequences, but she knew he wasn't done with her. She could barely sleep that night. Lying still on the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind replaying that moment, Grant's eyes, the way he let her go, no shout, no threat, just a terrible, cold silence. She wished he had shouted, or at least ordered, to humiliate her right there. At least she knew where she stood, but instead there was a waiting, an anxiety that couldn't be cut off. The next morning, she woke up with a sick feeling in her stomach. As she put on her uniform, her hands shook, trying to button each button. Maybe it would all be over. Maybe Grant had decided not to report the incident, maybe her phone would vibrate with a text message from the police station, telling her to report to the Internal Affairs office immediately. Her instincts told her something was wrong. At this point, Linda's breath caught, she couldn't help but feel it coming. She drove to the station in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel. As she entered, a cold feeling enveloped her. Eyes followed her, whispers were heard, but no one said a word. She knew this would not last long, rumors of what had happened would quickly spread. She could do nothing but face it. Officer Carson, Linda, feels tense when she notices her partner, Officer Reynolds, standing nearby amid the chaos. Grant, a character who appears to be their colleague, quickly gathers information and decides whether to move forward. Linda feels empowered, especially since she is uncertain about what is going to happen next and may face those consequences if she makes the wrong decision. During this time, Grant shows a cold demeanor with no apparent emotion and asks Linda if she wants him to continue his job. Linda feels the tension rising and tries to contain her emotions when confronted by Reynolds, who seems very concerned about the matter. He eventually leaves without saying anything more, leaving Linda helpless to move, watching his car disappear into the night. Finally, as Grant's car drives away, Reynolds turns back and asks Linda about the situation, but Linda can only remain silent and confused, unable to clearly explain what happened. The scene ends with tension and ambiguity about what is going on. That was the moment she realized things had gone too far. Her hands tightened around his collar, pulling him closer. Her breathing quickened, her heart pounding like a trapped animal. His eyes widened, surprise mixed with something unclear. But she didn't care. Who did he think he was? Her voice was low, almost slurring each word. Her fingers stiffened, her nails digging into the fabric of his shirt. He didn't answer, just looked at her with cold eyes. And then, before she knew it, her hand came down. A sharp sound tore through the silence of the alley. His head jerked to the side, but his body didn't move, still standing there, heavy, solid as a statue. Her breath caught. The air seemed frozen. A second stretched like a century. Then, very slowly, he turned his head. His face was expressionless, only his eyes were like a bottomless abyss. He reached into his coat pocket, the movement deliberate, purposeful. She froze. Her whole body screamed at her to run, but her legs seemed frozen in place. And then, he pulled out an object. Not a gun. Not a knife. But an identification card. She saw the name printed on it, and it felt like the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Ethan Carter. Her eyes slid down to the words below. Chief Inspector. Her breath hitched. Her whole body froze. Her mind was spinning, trying to sort out what had just happened. She had just hit her boss. Ethan still held the card in his hand, no sign of anger, no explanation. He just looked at her, waiting. But that made her even more breathless. She had to say something. Had to do something. But when her lips opened, not a single word came out. He leaned forward, opening his glove compartment. The movement was slow, controlled, as if he expected her to watch his every move. May I ask why he was stopped? His voice was low, soft, almost defiant. Linda crossed her arms, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't respond, didn't signal anything. A beat passed, her breathing slowed. She realized his eyes were scanning her, assessing the situation. There was nothing disrespectful in his tone, nor aggressive. But there was something subtle about the challenge that she didn't like. License and registration. She repeated, her tone firmer. He handed them to her without another word. His movements were steady, no shaking hands, no hasty explanations, no worried looks. Linda glanced at the ID, barely reading the name before turning it over. There was something about his calm demeanor that made her uncomfortable, an almost arrogant confidence. You live around here? She asked, her eyes searching. The man let out a sigh, but it was enough to be a statement. I don't see the point. Linda tightened her grip on the file. She had been in the business long enough to recognize uncooperative people. Long enough to know when someone thought they could get away with something. She straightened. Stepped out of the car. He looked up at her, his expression changing. The man's jaw shifted, his head tilted slightly, but he didn't object. Just a slow breath before he unbuckled his seatbelt, pushing the door open. Linda stepped back reflexively as he stood. Taller than she expected. Broad-shouldered. There was no tension in his posture, no hint of resistance. But still, something about his presence made her heart rate increase slightly. Opened the trunk. She gestured. The man breathed again, a slow, deliberate breath, before turning back to place his palm on the cold metal. Linda felt the change in that moment, an invisible shift in the balance of power. She thought she had it all under control. She thought she was doing her job well. But when Officer Linda Carson pulled over a black driver on a routine traffic stop, she learned the hard way that assumptions could ruin everything. This night had been quiet, until everything changed. The kind of shift Linda Carson had always found easy and carefree. It was well after 10 p.m., and most of the traffic in this part of Columbus had thinned out, slowed to a trickle. She sat in her patrol car, parked near a vacant lot, watching the cars, the occasional car rolling past, then she saw a shiny one. And then she saw it. A black sedan, passing in front. It was one of those expensive models, the one that looked like it belonged to some CEO, probably someone with a separate driveway. Nothing about it seemed out of place except for one small detail, no turn signal. A minor infraction, perhaps insignificant, but still reason enough to stop and ask the driver for papers. Linda felt a nagging reminder that rules were rules, and maybe only maybes. She shifted, accelerating enough to close the gap, turning on the siren. The sedan flashed as it slowed, then pulled gently to the side. Linda got out, one hand on her belt, the other adjusting the radio. The street quiet. Quiet, except for the hum of the streetlights above. After a moment, she approached the driver's window. The glass rolled down with an almost deliberate slowness. And then, there he was. A black man, neatly trimmed beard in his mid-40s, wearing a custom navy that looked expensive. He looked like someone who knew he belonged in this car. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his fingers moving gently, his eyes looking at Linda, not worried, not apologetic, just waiting for the license and registration. Linda felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't like the way he looked at her. No need to be afraid, no need to apologize, just simply waiting.